Today it's my, yeah, I turned it on, but it's on. Maybe I should use another one. Good afternoon. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Robert Lang. Professor Robert Lang is currently at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where he is a professor of sociology. He is also the UNLV director of Brookings Mountain West and also the director of the Lindsay Institute. Before 2010, he was the co-director of the Metropolitan Institute at Virginia Tech and the director of the National Capital Region of the Urban Affairs and Planning Program. Dr. Lang is currently the editor of Journal of Housing Policy Debate, and he holds fellowships at both the Brookings Institution and the Urban Land Institute in Washington, D.C. The research specialties of Dr. Lang include suburban studies, real estate, world cities, demographic and spatial analysis, housing, and metropolitan governance. Professor Lang has around 150 academic and professional publications, including several books. And he coined new concepts that are influential in how we view planning in the contemporary era, including boom burbs, edgeless cities, and megapolitan areas. Professor Lang is also influential in my career as he was one of the committee members of my PhD thesis. So today it's my extra great pleasure to introduce Professor Lang.
Can you hear me off this? Good. I like the title of this thing. Sounds like a Michael Moore film, doesn't it? You got The Truth About Florida. What truth do we need to hear about Florida? Well, thanks for that introduction. Yes, I have students in various universities. It's always a pleasure to come return and see them again. Today I'm talking on megapolitan areas, and let me just give you a background on the concept, where things stand. I'm writing a book with Chris Nelson, who is my colleague, who was the other co-director of the Metropolitan Institute at Virginia Tech, who we both apparently love the West because he went to Salt Lake and I went to Las Vegas. I like to joke he went to the City of Saints and I went to the City of Sin. So you know our world perspectives from that alone. And a brief mention of Brookings Mountain West. It's a branch of the Brookings Institution, the think tank in Washington, D.C. And due to a generous gift from Kirk Kerkorian, who was the largest shareholder in MGM Resorts International, we brought all of Brookings out, and we're actually even developing curriculum with the university. And it's a evolving relationship between the university and Las Vegas and the West and the Brookings Institution. The other thing is that, is that still on over there? Should give me feedback. The other thing is that that institute, although it's Brookings Mountain West, it's really Sunbelt Studies. It's bigger than just the West, you know, cities like Phoenix and Salt Lake and so on. It actually is everything from here to the West Coast. So because the focus of a lot of the Brookings Institution metro policy shop, which this is part of really, is it's the cities that they played baseball in until 1955. You know, St. Louis, east to Washington, north to Boston. And that's the space that a lot of the federal focus is on in terms of, you know, places like HUD and so on. And the Sun Belt is a kind of still newer space and isn't as well represented in the literature, and other than Los Angeles and the LA school, the kind of mid-tier cities of the Sun Belt like Miami or, you know, even Dallas where I was last week and Phoenix where I was last week are, you know, kind of still a sort of strange space in some of the public policy discussion, and certainly, you know, in the rest of the world and European community, they're not as familiar with those places. So part of the project is actually the enhancement of knowledge of the metropolitan dynamic writ large across all of the space, including South Florida, Central Florida. Going to the book that I'm writing, which is called Megapolitan America, megapolitan areas are different than megaregions. Megaregions include all of South Florida as one region. I should say the whole Florida Peninsula as one region, or the whole Midwest and so on. Megapolitan areas are actually taken from a name that the census was going to use for the largest core-based metros that were 1 million or above. The Office of Management and Budget in the Bush administration rejected the idea. You know, right now, if you're OMB and you're overseeing the census, you can speculate on lots of things, and there'll be a lot of interest in it in terms of the social science application under this administration. But in the Bush administration, they would not let the census redo too much of the urban geography. And they wouldn't let them give a tag on the very largest metropolitan areas and separate them out as a sort of family of big spaces for separate analysis. They did allow micropolitan areas. That was their rural constituencies' advocacy for the idea that, the Walmarts and Applebee's said, Scotts Bluff, Nebraska is a bigger city than anyone knows. Let's give it a tag. And they gave micropolitans a tag. We took instead the megapolitan label. Also, the census made a change in metropolitan definition, and they switched from a consolidated metropolitan statistical area to a combined statistical area that hardly anyone knows anything about, but could be the basis of a lot of policy making depending on which government's in power and how they define metropolitan space as far as all kinds of infrastructure and transportation funding. And a combined statistical area is one where you have enough commuting overlap to argue that there is a large-scale economic interdependence. And I'll give you some examples. Providence and Boston are technically in a combined statistical area. Baltimore, Washington. Akron, Cleveland. And the reason I raise this is that the book that we're writing is a projection to the year 2040. We use census data and also private data like Woods & Poole, which is a consulting firm in Washington and does a lot of census projection or their own proprietary algorithms and looks at jobs and everything like that going forward. The reason I mention that is that what we do in this book, what we do in this analysis, is we project the urban geography of 2040 based on the current definition of a combined statistical area. So when I say Tampa and Orlando merge into a region, they merge into a region. Statistically. I'll be more specific. Tampa, Orlando, Polk County in between. If you think about the I-4 corridor, Polk County has historically defaulted west to Tampa as a commuting shed. Lakeland rather. And the northeast part of the county has been relatively underdeveloped. A lot of ranching, actually. Some of it held by the Latter-day Saints, actually, in the neighboring counties as well along the I-4 corridor. So LDS church-held lands. Well, if you think about what's in southwest Orange County by commuting, it is large complexes of resort and entertainment, Disney, Universal. It's imaginable in time, given a few more decades, that the amount of population growth along the I-4 corridor in the northeast corner of Polk could produce enough commuting into Orange County to where the entire Tampa-Orlando metropolitan complex technically meets the criteria, and the most important criterion being the employment interchange measure. And the threshold is only 15% to get there, and it's already at 12%. So it is close. It may even be the 2010 census finds that Tampa and Orlando are one region. Now, why do I care about this? Because public policy in the United States is based on a 50 to 60-year-old definition of what constitutes a metropolitan area. And that definition began with economists actually lobbying the federal government for a unified definition because they were looking at housing markets and commuter areas and labor markets and retail sales and so on. That's based on functional integration. That's why it is a metropolitan statistical area. In a statistical sense, this region and Orlando never unify. Chicago never gets to Pittsburgh. Washington never gets to Boston. It doesn't happen. Under any scenario. They never gain true, large-scale, functional interdependence as defined by the age-old, well-tested, well-developed notion of economic interdependence, of commuter overlap. And the reason that economic interdependence is related to commuting is that if you think about it, if you're in one county and you commute to a job in another, then the social and economic conditions in the county you're coming from are dependent on the county that you're taking employment out of. And that if you lost your job, I've given talks in even the Washington region where I used to live. And I'd say, Maryland. And somebody would always come up to me and say, I've never even been to Maryland. I live in Virginia. I won't go there. All right, whatever. Your neighbor has a job in Maryland. If they lose the job in Maryland and they go on fire sale to sell the house in Virginia, you'll know you were in the same region. In other words, in a statistical sense, you're in the same region because you have this level of interdependence. The scale of interdependence keeps enlarging. And it enlarges because there are forces, not just the distance commuting, but even changes in the nature of work. And again, it's not that in the future I was promised that everybody was going to be able to phone their jobs in from home, which thankfully, it would be a country full of shut-ins, hasn't worked. The other reason, by the way, people have to go into work is that our telecommunications capability is so good that it manages to record everything we do and say, which in human dynamics is not always desirable, especially when you have the treachery of work engaged, where you have to know who's on the ups and who's on the outs and so on. You want to do that verbally. You want to convey that in face-to-face exchanges. In fact, our face-to-face exchanges have taken on a special urgency in that they're non-recorded, and that's a good thing right now. You can't get to be VP by phoning it in. You're not going to know where all the bodies are buried. So people need to go in, but they don't need to go in every day. Although college faculty, I remember when I was an undergrad, I was always upset that I'd find out that the college faculty lived like 200 miles from the university I was attending, and that they would take trains to it. I went to Rutgers University undergrad, and they would, I would find out somebody lived in Philadelphia. And I'd be like, Philadelphia? That doesn't seem very fair. Well, I don't have to show up every day. I come in 2 days a week, I do my office hours, and I do my work from home, and so on. Well, in the future, most advanced producer services in areas like management consulting, technologies, any areas like that, we're all college professors. And so the capacity of colonies of people who are well paid to live at some distance from work and to bring that space into a metropolitan economy means that the scale of this is much larger than it's been in the past. In other words, it's much vaster than it was. So even though there are resource constraints in terms of energy and so on, there's not much constraint in terms of the advancement of telecommunications technology, which will probably advance ahead of whatever constraints there are in energy. And as a result, the projection we have to 2040 is that all sorts of places unify. Phoenix, Tucson, Austin, San Antonio. Does all of Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio come together? No, it does not. Now, you could make a case that they are so proximate that capacity like high-speed rail should be built between them, because that's the distance that in the European model you would use to substitute rail for aircraft. The interesting thing is that the I-4 corridor and the Tampa-Orlando run is actually shorter than the air distance. There's only one flight from Delta between Tampa and Orlando. You're actually competing against other ground-based transportation, especially automobiles, when you build that capacity. There's two tiers really to the speeds in rail that you would use. The highest speed would be between this separate urban complex down here in South Florida and Orlando, which is 250 miles away. That's the sweet spot for high-speed rail. That's the point at which if rail goes fast enough, it substitutes for aircraft, because aircraft, when they fly, are tremendously efficient and fast, but the ground, the requirements for security and logistics and so on, and the congestion at airports get in the way. The loading of them even get in the way. But the space between Tampa and Orlando is like 85, 90 miles. It's almost too much capacity. There's a kind of regional-based high-speed rail, or higher than we have traditionally had, really at the level of the Acela, perhaps. But at too much speed, the Middle County Polk, which would like to use the high-speed rail for an anchor to create urbanization, high-density urbanization at the stops, has been told they get one stop because they got to get going, because you really got to be in a hurry between Tampa and Orlando. You could walk between Tampa and Orlando on some days and beat the traffic on I-4. There's no aircraft to hustle against. In other words, if you're doing Las Vegas, Los Angeles, you got to move, because you're up against every Southwest flight that's leaving 15 minutes, every 20 minutes or so out of places like Phoenix or Las Vegas. Their airports, you see Southern California traffic. So you would have to go high speed and make few stops. But through the nearly contiguous urban space of the I-4 corridor, you could actually have a slower train with more stops, and it would do better. And the reason is there's a difference between going through a megapolitan area a megapolitan area being really the combined statistical areas going forward, and region to region, and all the empty space between Tampa and Orlando.